This podcast is developed and funded by Pfizer. This podcast is for educational purposes only and not intended to replace a healthcare professional's advice. Hello and welcome to Roundtable Talk Cancer Clinical Trials and Ethnic Diversity. With me today, I have perspective from all sides of cancer clinical trials journey, and we'll be talking about the role of clinical trials and the importance of ethnic diversity and representation. I will start introductions with myself. My name is Dr. Olubukalaya Dele. I'm a consultant medical oncologist. That means a doctor that specializes in the treatment of cancer. And I'm the head of the breast cancer clinical trials unit at the Leicester Cancer Research Center. I am chief investigator and principal investigator on multiple clinical trials in the UK. And I will let the others introduce themselves. I have with me.
Hi, I'm Ellie. My current role is a study delivery manager working at Guy's and St Thomas's Hospital. I have been working on clinical trials there for about 6 years now. The majority was on breast oncology, but now looking into lung oncology. And I've worked on a large number of trials within the years, and that's me.
And to my right, I have Chris.
My name is Chris Fadipe. I'm a psychology graduate and a patient. I was diagnosed with multiple myeloma about 6 years ago. I'm glad to be here.
Okay, and we have Adeshawa.
Hi, I'm Adeshawa. I am a carer of a parent with breast cancer diagnosis. This was around 2018, 2019, and I'm also a current PhD student in cancer sciences.
Welcome, welcome. So it'll be really interesting to hear everyone's perspective as we have a diverse background. Chris, what do you understand what a clinical trial is and what's the purpose of a clinical trial?
Clinical trial mean different things to a lot of people. Diversely, some people, my background would think they don't want to be a guinea pigs. They are going to be used as a guinea pig. But nevertheless, clinical trial is just not for the patients that is being tried, that placed on the trial. It's for everybody. So, to my understanding, clinical trial is just a way of finding a better solution to an illness.
Absolutely. Thank you for your perspective, Adesua.
Yeah, just like carrying on what Chris said, I think from my understanding as well, clinical trials is a way of sort of testing in patients new treatments or new treatment intervention that's not really we know a lot about, but we don't know completely what this would look like. So I guess at the stage of clinical trials, it's seeing how the patient responds.
Absolutely. All right, Ellie.
So my perspective of a clinical trial would be so trying to improve and find new ways to not just treat but also diagnose cancer. It's not always about finding a cure. It's also about improving these patients' quality of life and also in trying to look at how we can reduce the side effects of maybe current treatments to help with their quality of life as well.
Yeah, really good perspective. So I think what I just wanted to add to that is that clinical trials are not just drugs, because a lot of times when we hear clinical trials, the first thing we think about is drug, but actually it's not just about drugs, it's interventions that could be devices, it could be a different type of surgery, it could just be intervention in terms of behavioral aspect, it could be a diet, but it's all about changing the patient's outcome for the better, like Chris mentioned. So it's always about improving the outcomes. And that's why we have trials. We have to make sure that it's better than what we have at the moment. So that's really good. So to Ellie, what is part of a clinical trials team?
So it's quite a big team. The patient-facing roles would probably be the principal investigator. That would be the main, the consultant doctor who is responsible for delivering and managing the trial at a site. And when we talk about a site, as in the hospital that's running the trial. And then you also have the sub-investigators, so also the other clinicians working closely with the PIs to help support and look after the patients on trials. And then within the clinical trials team, you also have research nurses. So they're usually the first point of call for patients on trials. If they need any advice or any help and support, that's probably their first point of contact along with the PIs. And then you also have clinical trial practitioners, so supporting the research nurses nurses. They're also there to support the team, but also have more of an administrative role for the clinical trial and running it. Also data managers, so responsible for inputting all the data that's collected from the patients and their tests. And then also behind the scenes, there's a large number of other roles. So there's people like quality managers, making sure that the trials are run
Smoothly?
pardon?
Smoothly?
But they're also in line with all of like the regulatory
The guidelines.
Guidelines. Also, we have clinical trial administrators, so they're just behind the scenes sorting out, like, for example, travel expenses for patients, making sure that patients get their money back to them when they're traveling for some of the visits for the trials. And then also you also have people like setup specialists who are in the background trying to make sure that we're running and opening new trials as others close. So it is quite a big team, but we all work closely together just to make sure that patients are supported, and there's a wide range of trials for patients to be a part of at sites.
Yeah. So from what I can hear you saying, Ellie, is that there's a big team, there's a wider team to what the patient sees, because a lot of time when the patient comes in, they see the doctor who is either the principal investigator or the sub-investigator. They meet the nurses, and then sometimes they meet the clinical research assistant, but there's a bigger team beyond that ensures that clinical trials are being run effectively, and also importantly, ethically, because I think that's usually what patients worry about, the ethical part of the clinical trials, like Chris mentioned, guinea pigs, so there are a lot of work that goes behind the scene that the patients don't see.
So UK studies have reported that the odds of being in a cancer trial are 30% lower for some ethnic minorities than their white counterparts. So why do you think it's important to have ethnic diversity in clinical trials? And I'm going to ask Adeshowa first for her thoughts.
Yeah, I think it's really important because a lot of cancer types affect certain groups more than other groups. So when it comes to like developing clinical trials, if we don't have clinical trials that are reflective of the population of cancer types, then when it comes to the treatment and interventions, I guess the question is, who is it actually beneficial for? And now in terms of research, we're moving on to sort of personalized treatments, genomic treatments, that are quite specific to certain groups. So when we're developing things, developing trials, and it's not actually transferable to different groups of people, it kind of defeats the purpose of what we're doing itself. So I think that's one aspect of quite important reasons rather why ethnic diversity is quite important in clinical trials, because we've seen it work quite well once we I'm thinking of certain breast cancer types that we've been able to understand that there's certain groups that are more prevalent to developing like BRCA sensitive breast cancer. So because of that, we can develop screening specifically targeted at certain groups. So past just the treatment, even at the initial start of cancer diagnosis, like developing pre-screening techniques, having the understanding properly of how different cancer types affects different groups allows us to develop better treatments or interventions.
And Chris?
Yeah, we have a lot of diversity going on, and tradition, cultural background, cultural heritage, religion have an effect on what people are involved in. As a matter of fact, some people believe that getting involved in clinical trials is not good for them, based solely because they don't want to be the first respondent of that kind of treatment. Not because it's not going to work for them, but because of their beliefs, because of their religion background, their tradition. Like I said earlier on, people think they're going to be guinea pigs, used as an example for something that has not been proven to be useful for them. But as we go on, we see how this affects everybody and how it's important for every ethnic group to be involved in this.
Um, Piggyback on what Adesu and Chris has said, I think it's important to account for diverse lived experiences and exposures to different population. I think one of the things Adesu has said was about what we know as pharmacogenetics, so the way drugs work in different races is different. So you need that exposure to understand how the drugs will break down or be effective in different diverse populations, but also talking about different racial and other populations who are experiencing health disparities. It's really important that everybody benefits from scientific advancement. So it's really, really important to get a diverse population when we do trials rather than what has historically been a lot of Caucasians.
Before patients are recruited into clinical trials, development and testing of this potential new cancer treatment has already taken place. Dr. Bookie, can you describe this development journey to the point of patient recruitment?
Thank you for your question, Ellie. So one thing about clinical trials is that it's to answer a question, okay? So there's a question called hypothesis. And for example, is would drug A work against cancer cells? So there's a journey from what we call the bench or the lab into the bedside or into the clinics. So if a drug is being developed, it starts from the lab. And if you're testing your hypothesis that does drug A work for cancer cells, then you test them first in a dish or in the cancer cells in a dish. And then if you see that there is some effect on the cancer cells by killing it, then you want to transfer that into animals. And if you see that this is working, that's when you move it into humans, which is usually what we call a first in human trials. But going back a little, before all of this is done, there's something called a protocol. So a protocol is a set of rules in code of how the trials is going to run. And before that gives like a proper set of steps. Who is going to be involved in the trial? What are you going to do if something goes wrong? And then this is set up to what we call an ethics committee. And they have to go through this protocol and make sure that that none of the patient's rights have been breached in any way. And then once that has been determined, then you then go forward with all of the steps. So the first in human trials is what we call a phase 1 trial. And usually what this is testing is different drug levels, and we're looking for safety. So we're looking at all the potential side effects that this drug could have. Once we know those side effects, and once we feel like there's a dose that we can manage the side effects at, we move it to a phase 2. So a phase 2 then involves more people. So in a phase 1, you have a lower number of patients involved. In the phase 2, you go to a higher number and you test that dose that you feel is right. And then you look out for more safety and what we call efficacy or effect of the drug. Once that has been established, we move it to a phase 3. And the phase 3 is where you use it against what we call standard of care or what is currently available. And then you want to see whether this new treatment is better or similar. And then you look at the toxicities or the side effects. Phase 4 is usually when the drug is already in the market and we want to get real world data. So that's usually a phase 4. But most of the phases that people hear would either be a phase 1, phase 2, or phase 3. So what I want to say is that there's a regimented and serious work that goes in the background before a trials actually comes to the clinic. So there's a lot of work that has been scrutinized, especially by the ethics team.
Thank you. That was very detailed.
Okay, so I'm going to check on how patients can find out how to participate in clinical trials. And because we have someone here who has been part of a clinical trial in Chris, I really want to get his idea. How did you get involved in your trial?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Roki. The consultant there was very, very good, very, very kind to me. And, he drastically take action and said, oh, dude, you need to be treated on this particular thing. So I was placed on some medication immediately, and as soon as the trial come open, he asked me if I want to be involved in the trial. It matters that you need to trust the medical team that are looking after you before you can volunteer yourself for this kind of thing. But the medical team I was assigned to were very good, and I trust their judgment. And I asked him, what are the things that I need to know? What is side effects? How am I going to be? Is it going to improve my quality of life? How long is it going to take? What is going to happen? So all the trials I've been involved in, three of them, let's say, are introduced by my consultant, by my medical team. I went through a lot of tests to see if I'm suitable for that kind of trial.
It's great. It's good that the oncologist is very aware of trials. Adeshawa, how was your mom? How did she get involved in clinical trials?
So her experience was there was sort of a new treatment that was already out there for her type of breast cancer. But here's something you could use that would improve your long-term response to the treatment. This is very scientific. So I sort of took that upon myself, did some reading. I think the first introduction, again, similarly, was from the consultant. Why don't you consider it? So I think similar to you, Chris, there was an option to say, do you want to take part in this? And let's discuss more.
That's great. So, Ali, apart from the healthcare professional in form of the consultant, how else do you think patients can be directed to finding out about clinical trials?
So, I mean, it's great that you've both said about the medical team because that's sort of where I would start with. Because, as Chris was saying, clinical trials, even if you are interested and want to participate, there is a heavy sort of screening process to make sure that patients are eligible for studies. And your medical team will know sort of your background, your cancer the best. They're the best people. There are online, I think there's a clinical trials website that lists which trials are open at which sites. The best person, the best team to speak with are the medical team because, as I said, the eligibility criteria for some trials are quite strict. So they're quite restrictive. But I mean, it is somewhere to start. And if there is something that you think that you would be interested in and you think that you do meet that criteria, then it's always best to go back to your clinical team. And even if you're not eligible for that trial, your clinical team could maybe direct you to another site that has a trial open. By just expressing that you are interested in clinical trials, they can often look around for you to see what trials could be available to you.
So I've had patients who come very prepared. They've done their fact finding, and they would come and say, "I've heard about this trial." So there are websites that you can check, especially in the UK, that would tell you available trials and where they might be. But it's always about bringing it back to your healthcare provider or your doctor because they are the ones that can tell you whether that's available currently in your institution. What's involved for the patient when participating in clinical trials? Because I think it's important to consider each patient's experience because they do vary on clinical trials. So, Chris, what has been your experience?
Yeah. For the purpose of this, at least it's imperative for people to learn that it's not always going to be the positive. People dealing with cancer are already dealing with positive and negative. So with my experience, I'll just use one of them. But one of the experience I had with one of my trials was after signing the consent, and I've spoken with my medical team. They analyze everything expected. There's possibility of this, there's possibility of that, and you should prepare yourself because we have individual differences. One person might have side effects, and some people might not even have it at all. So it's based on individual differences. So based on what happened, I was given the guidelines. Okay, days are days. You're being able to be at the hospital for 2 days, and then go home for 1 day, come back for 5 days. They gave me a lot of timetable when I'm going to stay. There was a time I was in the hospital for 2 weeks because they need to, monitor how I'm reacting to the treatment. I was reacting to the treatment. So At that time, every line was open to me to communicate my concern to the medical team. I can get them 12 midnight. I can get to them 1 a.m. That was available to me at all time for them to monitor. So, and even if I raise any issue at that point in time during the trial, they are there to support. I lost my taste bud for like half of a year. I couldn't taste any food. No matter how I eat, no matter what I eat, tastes the same. That was one thing that is so frustrating. That's why I say it's individual differences. I had my check 2 weeks ago. The guy said nothing, everything is still clear for the last 14, 15 months.
That's really helpful for our listeners, to know that um, there is benefit in participating in the clinical trial, even though there might be the
Yes.
downside of some side effects that come with it. Adesua, what was your mom's experience?
I think a bit of both sides. I think one of the more social effects of the taking part in trials or extended treatments in that sense was you sort of get to a point where you feel like you've done all your treatments and you can stop, but you're having to continue going through more treatments. It was difficult because it just feels like it's not ending. But I know this will be beneficial, but it's still difficult. I don't think there's any way to kind of sugarcoat that it comes with its challenges. Let's just say that. And what's helpful is when you're aware of that beforehand. If the consultants can tell you, hey, here's what might happen. We don't know exactly, but here's how we can support you. As you said, my mom had access to the research notes at any point, at any time of the day, because and she was. I don't think she could have gone through that without that kind of support. So I think it comes with its challenges, but there's also support around you as well to get through it.
Yeah, and I think it's very important that we highlight that people are supported through clinical trials. I think that's actually one of the highlights and benefits of being on a trial, that extra support that you get that you might not get if you are on a standard of care treatment. It goes, a little more in terms of monitoring and that support. So that's really good to highlight. So, Ali, from a healthcare perspective, what do you think is involved for the patient in participating in a clinical trial?
So, from my perspective, it depends on the clinical trial for the patients and also with their family and friends to really study that information sheet and know what you're signing up for before, because in that information sheet it will list, all the visits that the patient needs to come up to, and there's not. There's not like a time limit on how long you need to make this decision in. It's completely, you need to take as much time as possible. Yeah, and just know how many visits are coming up, because it can be quite stressful having to come up to a hospital, more than twice a week sometimes, and sometimes they are long visits. You just need to be very aware of what you're signing up to at the beginning. But again, some people may really like the close monitoring because they're being looked after a lot more. They again have a whole new team to support them, the research team. Balancing it out, it's a very individual preference of whether you want to be involved in a clinical trial, but it varies again with all different types of trials.
But I think it's important that we define the kind of consent that happens in clinical trials. So in clinical trials, there's something called an informed consent. Okay. And what an informed consent is that it's a process. There are really like 3 parts to it. So the first part is where you give all this information about potential side effects or potential benefits of a drug or a process that's happening in the clinical trial. And then the second part is the understanding. So you have to make sure that the patient actually understand that information that has been given. And then the third part is stressing the fact that it has to be voluntary. So your participation in a clinical trial is voluntary, and that the fact that you can come off it at any time without any explanation. When you give that information to patients, they are not to sign immediately. They need at least 24 hours to digest that information, because that way you know that they've thought through it So most of the times when we see patients, we give them that information either ahead. So you can have what we call a patient information leaflet sent to the patient ahead so that they've read it through, so that when they come to your clinic, it's easier to have that conversation. And they can sign then because they've seen something about it. But if that's the first time that you're talking to them, they need time to process that information. And I think this conversation has led very nicely into the next topic, because we really want to get a balanced overview of how participating in a clinical trial can affect a patient's quality of life and ability to work. Because from what you were saying, Ellie, patients might need to come more often, they might need to stay overnight. What does that mean for their work? What does that mean for pay? So I think it's important to hear from you how the trial supports that. So are they reimbursements that are given to patients for that?
Yeah, so I mean, it depends again on the type of clinical trial. Some trials can't reimburse patients for travel, some of them do. But it's important, again, when you are looking at the information sheet that you're given when you're considering a trial, to just take all that into account. So, yeah, so travel expenses is one. If you need to stay overnight because you live far away, sometimes they can reimburse you for that. But it's always good checking these things before you do sign up for the clinical trial. But yeah, when I'm looking at the good things, you gain a whole new team to support you. And it's also really important to know that even if you are on a trial where you get randomized to have the new treatment or the control arm, so in which you're just having the standard of care treatment, you're not in any way monitored less closely. You're monitored just as closely as someone who is on the new treatment.
Yeah, so I think it's really good that we highlight the pros and cons of being on a clinical trial. From what I've heard from everyone, is that the pros is that you're well supported, you're well monitored. If anything changes, you have that ability to get help very quickly, which you might not have if you were not on a clinical trial. But also the cons is that you have to be in the hospital more often, which then affects your ability to work. If you're supporting your family, that might be an issue. Also, the side effects could potentially affect your quality of life. So that's also important.
And I think Chris and I sort of mentioned briefly about sort of the role of the control arm and just how important it is alongside just the treatment arm as well. But I'm just going to ask Dr. Bookie more about what is the role of a control arm? What does that mean in cancer clinical trials?
Yeah, thank you. So when we talk about control arm, we usually use that term in a phase 3 trial. And it's basically you having the existing treatment or the standard of care of treatment. So the other arm, which is the trial arm, is looking at this new treatment. The control arm is looking at what is already existing. And then there's some other words that we use as well, things like randomized. So randomized just tells you that usually a computer would generate ways where patients go on which arm of treatment, and it allocates people to what arm. From the start of the trial in the protocol, they let you know how many people are supposed to be allocated. So you can hear words like 1-to-1, 2-to-1. 1-to-1 means that there's equal number of patients in both arms. 2-to-1 means that there's more patients in the treatment arm compared to the control arm. I think placebo is also a word that people hear in clinical trials, and it's important to know that if you're on a placebo trial, it's placebo plus the standard of care or the control. So you don't just go on a trial where you're given nothing, because that's not ethical. So if you are on a placebo trial, it's with what's already the standard of care. And in those kind of situations, what we're looking at is there a benefit in adding an extra treatment to the current standard that we have? It's important to know that you are getting the standard of treatment, even though you're on the placebo arm.
Thank you. And sort of putting that question again towards Chris and Adeshowa, sort of what is your understanding of the role of the control arm as well? Have you had any experiences?
Well, Generally speaking, people would think they are going to miss out on the normal treatment they're supposed to receive when they're on trial, but that is not the case.
Yeah, and just to add on to that is even if you're on the controlled arm or the standard of care arm, you get more monitoring than if you were on
Yeah.
the normal standard of care outside of a trial. So you get more frequent scans, you have more visits to the hospital, and that's usually very comforting for a lot of patients, knowing that they're being monitored a little bit closer. You know, I've had that patients say that psychologically that has really helped them.
The biggest misconceptions, because I think when people are placed in the control arm, they want to know if it's a blind study, am I placed in the control or in the treatment arm? Because I think if I'm placed in the control, you're not going to take care of me, you're not going to look after me, and if anything happens, you don't care enough, right? But I think explaining that the control arm that they will still get the standard care of treatment and even more monitoring hopefully offers a lot of comfort to people to know that it's not it's just as important as the treatment arm, not less than.
Yeah.
Because oftentimes it's been pushed as I just want to get the treatment. That's the whole point of the clinical trial. But being in the control is just as valuable as being in the treatment arm.
So when we talk about being blinded on a trial, for some trials, we will not know what treatment you're getting. It will either be the new treatment or the control arms, the standard of care treatment. In some trials, they won't let anyone know. So the patient, the clinical team, even the pharmaceutical company, the sponsor side, that they won't know. But it is also important just to say if, for any emergency medical reason, or if it would to affect your treatment options later down the line, they can unblind you and find out what you are on. So that's sort of what we mean by being blinded on a clinical trial. You're not aware of what treatment you're getting.
Yeah, so when it comes to usually phase 3 clinical trials, you hear certain words like open label. Open label means everybody knows what's happening. You have single blinded. Single blinded means the participants and the doctors don't know, but the sponsor, which could be the pharma company or it could be the academic institution, knows. And then there's the double blind where nobody knows, because everything looks exactly the same, and it just gives a little bit difference. But like Ellie said, if you want to come off the trial or if something happens to you in terms of toxicities or side effects, then you can be unblinded in order to know how best to support you through whatever you're going through. So it's not set in stone, and it's important to know that.
So it's bringing us on to the next question, bringing it back to the ethnic diversity. Just wanted to talk about some of the barriers to ethnic diversity and appropriate representation in cancer clinical trials. So I'm going to ask Dr. Becky first for your thoughts.
I think you look at it from the individual point, you look at it from the systemic point or the systems. So for individuals, I think you mentioned it, Chris and Adesua, that it was your consultant who mentioned it to you about the trial. So simple things like awareness. So if the consultant does not know that there's a trial, then how can they offer it? So it's important that the consultant knows that there is a clinical trial. Also, I would say trust is a big thing. Well, there's been issues where people of ethnic minorities have been used in wrong ways in trials, and that still plays in the mind of people, and they want to be sure that they're not being served in the wrong direction. So I think that trust is really important. Some of the barriers when it comes to the systems is that accessibility, to the hospital is a problem. Also, the lack of supporting infrastructure in that institution. And that's why you find that a lot of affluent areas in the country will have more trials compared to other parts. But we need to understand that we need to look at different regions to be inclusive. So we can have all the trials in the big city while other people in the other places are deprived of that trial. So that in itself becomes a barrier to having ethnic minorities, because we know that due to social economic issues, a lot of times people in minority ethnic groups will live in areas that are not affluent, meaning that automatically they would not have a trial being offered to them. And if they are already, due to the social economic determinant, are not affluent, then even to travel to other parts of the country might be an issue for them. So automatically they can get involved in a clinical trial, So I think that's important to highlight in terms of barrier. One of the big things I also think is language, communication. A lot of times the um, supporting materials available or information available to patients are in English, and people of ethnic minorities might not speak English or might not understand English to that level. So having I talked about an informed consent earlier on. They have to understand what they're doing, and if it's in English, sometimes these words are not easily translatable from English to their language. So it needs someone who is who can translate that better. And that's one of the reasons why it's important also to have a diverse workforce, because if there is someone who is coming from their background in that team, that trials team, then that's a plus, because then they are able to explain in a manner that they would understand, because culture is a big thing, communication is a big thing.
Thank you. And sort of your thoughts as well, Chris and Adesanya.
I had an experience whereby I have to travel 1 hour to go and attend my appointment for the trial, because it's not available where I'm living. So I have to drive 1 hour, and I got to go maybe 3 times a week. Even I was advised to just stay in the hospital, because traveling and coming back is for us to be able to monitor you correctly, you need to be close by. So stay in the hospital. It was uncomfortable. But I was fortunate, because my employer understand my situation, and then I informed them about it. So I was allowed to go for my treatment without any economic problem with it coming with it for me. But some people might not have that kind of situation. So if it happens that way, economically, socially, mentally, it's have adverse effect on people. So majorly ethnic people like us, that we are from different ethnic background. It's about, will I be able to stay in the hospital for this long? Will I be able to, who's going to look after my kid? Who's going to pay my rent? Who's going to do a lot of things attached to this?
Everyone wants to get better, but at what cost, right? Because I think those are the things that points to the barriers that people face. So even things like the way that the study is designed, is it designed in a way that's actually taking in consideration the patient's journey? Or is it just, we need to get things validated? I just remember the journey of the long hours and the late nights driving back and forth. So I think all of these things add on to why people might not even want to take part at all. And I think a main part is financial reasons, because it's like, oh, we don't like to talk about money. But I mean, a huge part is financially, because people oftentimes support not just themselves, but their kids and also family back at home. So if I'm not working, or if they're not working, or my mom's not working, who's going to take care of not just my kids, myself, but also people at home? And sometimes there's a disconnect there if we don't understand the cultural reasons behind that. And I think another aspect that we've not really touched on is also what is the support in terms of mentally and psychologically. So yes, I'm signing up onto a trial, but how do I get support in that aspect as well? I know I'll be looked after in terms of like monitoring, but is anyone asking, how am I actually feeling? How am I doing? How am I processing being on a trial? So I think all of these things that a patient might be thinking of, And it's like a skill, right? If all of this is outweighed, let me just not go forward with this. So, but these are things that can be tackled if we look past just the patient, but how have we developed the system, developed the study designs that would benefit patient properly in their journey in the trial.
Thank you.
So it's really interesting listening to everyone talk about the barriers, and I think they're really important for us to understand it, for us to be able to tackle it. So I'm going to go to Ellie first. In your opinion, what can be done both now and in the future to help diversify patient involvement in cancer clinical trials?
So going back to what you said about accessibility, so we do have in the UK leading clinical trial sites which are primarily based in big cities. I think it is sort of like a postcode lottery in which, if you live near a leading clinical trial site, you are going to most likely hear about a clinical trial if you are potentially eligible for it. But I think reaching out to maybe smaller hospitals to let them know sort of what trials you are running is really important. So, for example, with Guy's, it's in the South East London, but reaching out to maybe smaller hospitals within South East London, just letting them know of what's available at our site, so that if they do have any patients who are interested in trials and could be eligible, they could be referred to the hospital. But again, that doesn't really help with the whole distance. If patients are travelling very far to get to our site, that's also not ideal. But maybe setting up these hospitals to be able to collect some tests, like blood tests, having them done at their local hospital rather than bringing them all the way up to the main site, which is like an hour away. Just by reducing that distance and the time that they're spending coming up to the hospital can be quite beneficial. So that's probably one of the main things that maybe clinical trials could start looking into.
So what I'm hearing, Ellie, is decentralization of trials.
Yeah.
So this is very important, like you said. Even if people can come to the big hospitals for things like their blood test or ECGs or things like that, because those are the things you're coming for most of the time. Probably the smaller hospitals could be able to do it. So this is very important going forward to decentralize clinical trials, not just let it be in the main hospital.
So another sort of thing with the accessibility, we've been talking about like the patient information sheets quite heavily. They're very big documents. And I think if trials can maybe use other resources like videos rather than just solely relying on patients having to read through these really extensive information sheets, I think that's quite outdated. And I think that there should be new ways that patients can learn about clinical trials, what's involved, rather than just reading through these huge documents at times.
I think that's a really good idea for sponsors going forward for trials to use something more engaging rather than having people to read through loads and loads of document.
Some patients feel like being part of a clinical trial, you're sort of this guinea pig. But I think for the research team to learn, be educated on how to speak with these patients and just explain sort of how they're not going to be guinea pigs, how they're going to be well supported, just so they have all the correct information when they're considering a trial. They still might not be interested, it still might not be for them, which is absolutely fine, but just making sure that they understand sort of about the clinical trials, and by teaching the research team how to have these discussions, I think is quite important as well.
Yeah, that's very important. I think while we're talking about communication, I think I still have to go back to the fact that most trials have English as the basic language, and then there's a heavy reliance on interpreters. And most of the times these interpreters are not medical background at all. So they find it difficult as well to interpret. And because you don't know what they're saying to the patient, it's very confusing. And sometimes the patient could say, but no one ever told me that. But you felt that they've been told that through the interpreter, but you don't know what the interpreter is saying. So I think having information in their own language is easier for assimilation and understanding, so that definitely you can say patients have had informed consent going forward. It just makes things easier for them. So I think that's one of the ways we could eliminate the barriers for ethnic minority groups getting involved in clinical trials. I'm going to go to Adesua. What do you think we can do to try and eliminate or narrow this barriers that we've raised?
It's important that people are in the communities that they serve themselves. So, for instance, if you are in a space where you know that your hospital or the trial center is based around a lot of faith groups, churches, actually going into those spaces. And there's this common phrase that people from ethnic groups are difficult to reach or hard to reach, which isn't exactly true. It's that you're not coming to them, to where they are. It's quite hard to start speaking to someone at the point of the diagnosis on a wider scale. How can we get into those spaces already, start those conversations, understand what is actually affecting these people here? Is it the distance? Is it location? Is it some biases as well? How can we understand what the issues are and then work more targeted to actually address them?
Absolutely. So community engagement is really, really important because, like I said, if they're not coming to you, then you go to them.
Mhm.
People of ethnic minorities are not difficult to reach. A lot of this ethnic minorities are very, very community strong. You know, it's a culture. And then to Chris, what do you think can be done in this regard?
Okay, you said it all. Communication is key. Before it get to a trial stage, a particular medication has gone through a lot of processes. So people still think that okay, the medication is just from somewhere, and then they just want to test it on me. But for the fact that this medication has gone through a lot of process, so that communication is very important, tailored to the need of ethnic minority. Another thing is the support. At what cost am I going to be able to pay my mortgage if I'm hospitalized? Uh, I remember there was a time I wasn't able to work for like 4 or 5 months because of the side effect of my treatment, and there was COVID. So there should be more support system for people from you know all walks of life. It's not just the ethnic background alone. We need support, and that fear, like Kadisha said, you have to think about African people or people with ethnic minority. They have large family dynamics. Another thing is that taking cognizance that triad does not limit the cultural and traditional beliefs. People would think, okay, my religion doesn't allow that. They are different. They are different perspectives. They are different things. So it doesn't reduce your belief. It doesn't reduce your traditional belief. It doesn't reduce your religious belief. It's just to support you and to make sure you are well taken care of.
So I'm moving on to the next question. So I'm going to ask Adeshoa first. What is the best way, in your opinion, that you think that the healthcare professionals and the clinical trial team can communicate about cancer clinical trials to their patients?
Um, my first thing that came to my head is just to talk to them, as in actually say it directly to them. But I think also to involve the family in this. It's how can we together explain these things, work together with the family, work together with a close community to make sure that this patient is supported the best way as possible. I mean, in speaking to patients and previous advisory groups I've been through, sometimes it feels like we just want to get you out the door. Yes, explain it, but get you out the door because you're under stress. There's a lot of things happening at the same time. But I think in things as important as this, it needs patience, it needs empathy to actually understand the cultural reasons why I may decide I don't want to take a clinical trial, but who can I speak to? Who can I seek to understand why this patient might be thinking of this? Let it be more of a discussion than a one-off presentation, and then we never address this ever again. Because they might say yes or no to this clinical trials, but they might say yes to another one. So taking each one as it comes, I would say.
Thank you. And Chris?
Well, clinical trials, making decision about it is always down to the patient anyway. So it's the choice of the patient to accept or not accept the clinical trial. However, cancer patients, we need a mental support from the onset. As soon as they were diagnosed, there should be a mental or a psychologist attached to the team that's looking after them. All right. So most of the time, it can be very overwhelming. The way I'm going to communicate with Adesha is going to be different from the way I'm going to communicate with Dr. Buki. The way I'm going to communicate with Ellie is different. So everybody has that way of listening, and making sure that they understand the situation at hand is very important. The doctor should be able to understand that this is not an easy discussion, and getting the information across to that person is very, very vital. So if the communication get lost in transit, that is why we're having this problem we're having now. The communication get lost in transit, and people don't really understand what the doctor are talking about. So it's come to the decision of the patient. So communicating better with empathy, with the support that, okay, we are here for you to support you. Whatever you need, we are going to make sure that we can support you as much as we can. That is reassuring, and that is very important when doctors communicate to the patients.
So building that sort of trust between the patient and your doctor, yeah. And Dr. Bookie, what would you say the best way is?
I don't think there's a best way, to be honest, because a lot of this issue is multifaceted. However, as we've all mentioned today, I think we have to understand that the communication actually starts from outside the room. So if a lot of the work has been done in the community, knowing that a clinical trial is there to help people rather than to use for experiments, that's a lot of work that's been done already, because we have to take the culture. It's easier to talk about trials to a Caucasian because they've been exposed to what a trials is. They might have an idea of what that is. For people in minority ethnic groups, and they're different. So you have people who are of minority ethnic groups who have grown in England. However, a lot of people, especially Africans, are coming newly into the country, so they don't understand the system. What they're used to is different, which is why that information and education and awareness is important from onset, from the outside. So when they actually do come into the clinic, a lot of your work is done already. When they get into the clinic, we have to realize that we need patience and time. Like Adesua said, we need timing for these conversations. These are not the conversations that you can do in 10 minutes or 15 minutes. You need to dedicate time in order to be able to answer whatever question that is coming out and answer it with empathy, for the patients. Also, one of the things I do in my practice is I usually would say come with someone, because when you come alone, it's such a different scenario for the patient. A lot of time they're scared, they're overwhelmed with the information, but when they have support with a family that has come with them, it's reassuring for them. It gives them that assurance. Also, someone else is listening. So there's another set of ears that they can then go back and discuss. But when the information is coming to only one person, it's difficult to engage because, like Chris has mentioned, the ethnic minorities is a big community and family group. So they will get home and their family is saying, what did they say to you? And they can't replay it because they've just been overwhelmed by that day. They don't remember anything. But if someone comes with them, because, for example, so you had some insight into what was going on with your background in science, you were able to help your mom make that decision to get on a trial from your perspective.
And that's why, as well, taking the time to read the information, taking it home, writing out all your questions as you go along, discussing it with family and friends is really important because it is a big decision and it needs to be an informed decision that you make. So you need to have that time and speak with your family and friends to gain their thoughts as well.
Okay. Ellie, do you know any supports that it's available for patients with limited English at all?
So there should be either face-to-face interpreters available, or they can sometimes, if they're not available, have interpreters available on the phone. Specifically for clinical trials, there should be translated information sheets available. But this is sometimes quite limited with the time it can take to translate information sheets, which is a barrier.
Okay. Well, like Ellie mentioned, I think currently what's available most of the time is either an in-person interpreter or interpreter phone line or something like that. But I think we can do better. I think going forward, things like probably AI would be very helpful in helping translate for patients.
For clinical trials specifically, we have to have a face-to-face interpreter there for the information giving. So when you receive the information, and also for the consent consultation. And as we are aware, the NHS is obviously quite limited with their resources anyway. So that can also put a delay for the patients that can't speak limited English on this whole process, which can also be quite a big barrier for patients participating in clinical trials.
That's really great. So to Chris, and I'm going to get Adeswa's opinion as well. What are you going to say to someone who has been recently diagnosed with cancer and is considering participating in a clinical trial?
All right, it's something to consider. I would say that it's something to consider because it's not just good for you. It might help a lot of people as well. That is all my experience, but based on my experience. So participating in trials, like I said, it's just not only beneficial to you, to yourself, it can be beneficial to other people as well. Basically, it's down to your decision. It's up to individual person what they want to do, how they want to proceed with their treatment. So that's what I would say.
I think just literally echoing your point. I think the ultimate aim of or understanding that the ultimate aim of the trial is not to make you feel worse. No one's, but the doctors and the nurses, the researchers are trying to improve your outcome. It's important to know that there is no one forcing you into this. You shouldn't feel that I have to do this. It should be I want to do this or I get to do this. Having that understanding puts ultimately the power back in your hands, knowing that at any point of the trial, the power is still in my hands. So I can ask questions, I can decide to stop, I can decide to continue, I can decide to take a break.
Yeah.
Because I get to decide everything.
Absolutely. And Ellie?
If you are considering a clinical trial, it's so important at those initial steps to read through the information sheet. Don't rush it through, make questions. I always say to the patients when we meet with them to begin with, just as you go through, because they are lengthy documents, to write down your questions as you go along, highlight whatever you would like to bring up at the next consultation. No question is a silly question. Someone's probably had that same question along the line. If you want to speak with the research team before you have a chat with the consultant at the next appointment, you've got their numbers, you've got that support, you can ask them. And also, more specifically to the information sheet, when you're reading it through, it can be quite daunting. They have to list every single possible side effect that anyone has ever had on this specific treatment, which can be very daunting and can be quite scary. So also bringing that up with your doctor, just to go through sort of what you can expect from their experiences. If you do have any concerns with regards to expenses, we have had actually a very strange request for dog sitting, which a trial did actually reimburse for their dog to be looked after whilst they came up. So again, no question is a silly question. If you do have these concerns, just bring them all up, just cover all basis and just take your time reading it. If you do consent and then change your mind, then that is absolutely not a problem. You don't need to explain yourself. You can withdraw at any time. So even if you do change your mind, that's not a big issue at all.
It's your choice, and you should know that you have that power at any time to make that decision. But also ask questions always. If something is not clear, Make sure you're asking questions at every step of the way. Also, if you do go on trials, my advice is that please let the trials team be aware of everything you're going through. Most likely, you'll be given a diary to put down all the information of what's going on.
Yes.
Please do play your role and play that part, because it's very, very important to know how you're feeling, because that's the whole point. We want to get different races or ethnicity involved, and we need to know how different this would be to other people involved. So it's very important that you document everything that's happening to you while you're on the trial. Okay, so it's been very robust today, and I'm going to come to everyone to ask what your key message would be from today. So, what are you taking away?
So I think the one key message that the listeners should take away from today is that just the whole point of the clinical trials, that it's actually for you, it's there to support you. And at the end of the day, you are the deciding factor in the clinical trial. So take the time, ask questions, speak to people, inquire, but just have in the back of your mind that this process is to help you, is to support you.
Okay, Chris.
Yeah, I'll just echo that again as well. Like, ask for the details of everything you want to be involved in. Ultimately, it's your decision, and there's nothing bad in saying yes or no to it. If it's up to you, it's what you decide that happens. So if you have any concern, talk to your medical team.
Okay, and Ellie?
Primarily, the clinical trial might not be for you, and it might be for you. It's completely a personal choice. You just have to take the time, if you are considering a clinical trial, to weigh out the pros and cons and see if it does work with you.
My takeaway to anyone listening to us today is that if you're getting involved with a clinical trial or getting on a clinical trial, it's important to have that discussion with your healthcare provider, preferably your oncologist, what type of trial you're going on. Because the kind of information you'll be given, if it's a phase 1, would be different from if it's a phase 2 or if it's a phase 3. It's very important to read that patient information leaflet. It can be daunting because it has everything in it, and it's just important that they have to list everything. Doesn't mean that that's going to happen to you, but it's important to be aware, because if you don't know what could happen, then how can you tell us? So that's why that information is there. So that would be my take-home message today. So thank you to our panel today for sharing your insights and experience of cancer clinical trials. It's been very, very insightful and educative. I've learned a lot from you that I'm going to take back to my practice. So thank you very much. And I hope the audience has also learned a lot today. Thank you very much for joining us.